The brass letters on the restaurant door caught the afternoon sun like a promise. They glowed honey gold against black varnish, Harrington and Co. Clare Donovan paused so long that the heat of the metal warmed her fingertips through the fabric of her second-hand navy dress. In her purse, folded beneath a tissue and a bus ticket, were 4 crumpled dollar bills. $4 and a hope the size of a rumor. She had walked 20 blocks to get here. Her shoes pinched. The hem of the dress had been taken in by Mary in the back kitchen that morning, a neat, invisible stitch. Clare smoothed her palms over the purse as if smoothing might make the money feel bigger. Outside, city sounds pressed at the glass. A garbage truck, 2 distant horns, the murmur of a summer that had not yet decided whether to rain. Inside, the restaurant promised distance, plush, hushed, a world arranged by people trained to look the other way. The door opened for her with a soft, practiced thud. The lobby smelled of lemon oil and burned butter. A bell tinkled somewhere behind mahogany. A waiter in gray pressed a ledger to the small of his chest and looked at her over his eyebrows. The list of reservations carried names with commas and titles. Hers, if it had been made for her by another person, would have had none. She sat at table 7 anyway. The linen was thick and cool, the napkin folded like a white flag. She placed her purse on the chair seat beside her and, out of habit more than hunger, glanced at the place setting across from her. A napkin lay unused, knife and fork matched like twins. Her phone, a cheap model with one cracked corner, slid in and out of her pocket like a nervous animal. A photograph of Arthur, stooped, cap in hand, wind-torn coat, was in the lock screen. She thumbed it and pressed the screen to the table as if to hold him there with her. Her classmates had said this was a blind date. Jessica Moore had smiled at the idea and said it would be hilarious to see Clare in a restaurant like this. Kevin had laughed in a way that sounded like money sliding across a table. Rumors were currency at school. Clare had known it. She had known, too, that rumors could be spent to buy attention. Her hand curled around the $4. She had not planned to eat. She had planned to sit, to show up once, and then walk back home with the feeling of having arrived, if only for a moment. A rehearsal of belonging. A private experiment in pretending. The waiter appeared with a menu that felt heavier than it looked. He explained specials in a voice that folded around the syllables of the salmon and the truffle. Tap or sparkling, he asked, expecting a preference that would signal disposable income. Tap, please, Clare said. She did not want the clink of a bottle to be the sound of her exposure. It was cheaper and less conspicuous. And just coffee would be fine. "Very well," he said, and there was a brief, unreadable tilt to his mouth, as if a calculus had been run, and she had failed to produce the right numbers. He left, the ledger tucked back under his arm like judgment. She tried to read the menu. A line from one of Mr. Harrison's lectures ran through her mind. People in power learn to convert everything into an exchange. But the letters on the menu blurred into shapes. She took a breath and steadied herself with scenes she loved more than menus. Arthur's slow whistle over the kettle, her mother's hands at the sink. The room was warm, the lighting forgiving, and for one small stretch of time she allowed the weight of the day to lift. Then her phone buzzed. It was a single vibration, but in the quiet room it sounded like glass. Clare flicked the screen, and her stomach dropped into the shoes that pinched her feet. There, bright and unkind, were the photos. 2 of them, 3 now, captured from the angle of someone standing just behind her shoulder. One showed her from the back, navy creased under the restaurant light. Another was a close-up of the $4 bills peeking from the purse, the edges yellowed, the folds like a map. A third captured the place setting, as if it had been waiting for someone who would not come. The caption rolled like a stone down a hill. "Bet she thinks she belongs. #cultural tourist." Jessica's laughing face emoji. Kevin's thumbs up. Clare's throat closed. a pressure that had nothing to do with the physical proximity of the room, built inward, heavy and immediate. People turned, not because they were cruel, but because curiosity is its own architecture. A head moving, a murmur like a feather dragged across glass. Cameras, phones, lifted to the light in an instinct that had less to do with compassion and more with spectacle. The waiter came back, and his courtesy had a sharp edge now. "Are you all right, miss?" "I'm fine," she lied. Her voice was smaller than she wanted it to be. She folded her hands over her purse as if to hide the money in plain sight. "Please, just the coffee." A laugh, a small bubble of sound, near the corner table. It carried the flavor of a shared secret among strangers. Clare felt it like heat on the back of her neck. The room, which had been accommodating, became a balance sheet. Attention credited, dignity debited. She could have left then. That was the safe option. Stand, slide the purse under her arm, and walk back out into the city where people were too busy or too scattered to have much of an opinion about a single girl in a navy dress. It would have cost her the exercise of pride, but it would have spared her the feeling of a room making a decision about her worth. Something in her would not let her fold. She thought of Arthur in the armchair, of the way his jaw had lined itself when he taught her how to hold even a small defeat without handing over the rest of herself. We don't bow. We don't break. Those were not commands so much as tools, the kind that let a person keep standing when the world wanted them on their knees. Across the room, between a crystal carafe and a bowl of olives, there were eyes watching. Nathan Harrington sat at a small cluster of tables that spoke of status without saying it outright. A bottle of wine with its foil half torn, a correct absence of nervous laughter, a man in a suit whose presence was a punctuation mark. Robert Harrington had his elbow on the table and his hand on his chin, as if weighing the world on that single curve. Nathan's attention, however, had slipped away from the wine list and toward the girl in the navy dress. He watched with the kind of concentration that made people look as if they were waiting to judge. He did not move immediately. He let the scene balance, like a scale, to measure where it would fall. His jaw tightened. There was irritation in that tightening. Not at Clare, he would have told himself later, but at the architecture that allowed cruelty to look like entertainment. He rose because something in him rose before he had a speech ready. It moved like a tide, certain and sudden. He walked to her table in a way that announced him, shoulders set, a small explosion of attention following like birds. Conversations tilted. The waiter straightened, as if called upon to perform an act with slightly different stakes now. When Nathan reached her, he did the simplest, most direct thing. He sat down. The chair made a soft scrape. He looked at her, not at the phone, not at the purse, but at the line of her mouth. "May I?" he asked. "You're with me," he said, to the room, to the waiter, to anyone listening. His voice measured like a verdict. The sentence landed with quiet force. Heads turned more sharply now, some with curiosity, some with annoyance. A woman at the bar pretended not to be listening. A man in a jacket eased his shoulders back. Robert Harrington watched his son claim the object of another table's amusement as if he were reading a line of someone else's script. He said nothing. His face, however, tightened around something like distaste. He had built his life on calculations that left little room for sentiment. To be moved by spectacle was, to him, an indulgence that dissolved order. Sentiment was a weakness, he would say another time. It spread like mildew through whatever it touched, leaving rot. His beliefs had been forged in boardrooms and tempered by the idea that the world rewarded strength. Nathan ignored his father's distance the way someone ignores wind. He flagged the waiter. 2 coffees, he said, and a bowl of fries. He meant the fries as defiance, or perhaps penance. Clare could not have known. He was trying to buy a space in which the cruel spectators would have to reconcile the image of a billionaire's son sitting across from a girl with $4 and decide what they were. Claire blinked. A bowl of fries? It sounded like an insult. She had not come for pity, nor would she accept a performance that treated her as a prop. She looked back at him, and there was a flash in her eyes that made Nathan feel, for the first time that day, the complicated truth of what he had done. He had meant to interrupt the joke. Instead, he had stepped into a role where his interference would be read as charity, an exchange of money for dignity that left the dignity bound. "That's kind," she said, and the sentence carried something like a blade. "But I didn't come here to be bought." He heard the accusation and felt it like cold water. He thought of the ledger in his father's hands, of shareholders and quarterly reports. He thought, less clearly, of being watched at every decision by a legacy that wanted him to be precise and efficient and, above all, unemotional. "I'm not trying to buy anything," he said. "Sit, eat, stay." He said it in 3 short commands, as if commands could fix the momentum of a room. "Maybe I don't want to stay," Claire said. "Maybe I want to leave with my feet and my pride." "You don't have to explain anything to them," Nathan said. "Doesn't matter if I explain to you," she replied. "You don't get to decide what I need." There were people who thought this a small scene. 2 teenagers at a table, a misunderstanding made louder by attention. Others saw it as something noisier, an incursion into the delicate performance of the room. Waiters exchanged looks. The waiter returned with a pot of coffee and a silver carafe of hot water, and set a bowl of fries down between them as if he were resetting a table with a neutral gesture. But the pizza of attention had already been sliced. Claire pushed the fries away. "I'm not hungry," she said. "Then don't eat," Nathan replied. He tried to make his tone neutral, but a line of something, defensiveness perhaps, cut through. He reached out and picked up her phone where it lay, unlocked it with a thumb he didn't know was allowed, and scrolled. He read the messages, photos, laughing emojis, the stream of a group's glee, and his expression hardened like a man taking notes. "Those kids," he said softly, "I can talk to their parents." "No," Claire snapped. She dropped the word like a stone. "Don't. I do not need your interventions. No parents, no boardroom apologies. Leave it alone." It was as if the room inhaled. The initial amusement curdled into interest in the fight. People leaned forward as if to watch a play with an outcome they might later claim to have predicted. There is a particular shame in being the center of someone else's story without consent, and Claire felt that acutely. She could already feel the way it would be discussed at school, the story sewn into the fabric of gossip, stitched into locker room comments, reposted with commentary. "What you need," Nathan said, more quietly now, not out of manipulation, but from a dawning recognition that he was in dangerous territory, "isn't to be protected from them. It's to be recognized." "Recognition doesn't come with fries," she said. "It comes with choice. You gave me a choice you didn't ask me about." His face changed in a way people often missed. There was a fracturing behind the eyes, a recognition that his impulse to act had less to do with justice and more to do with being seen doing the right thing. He had walked across that room because he had been moved. What if, he thought with a flash of something like dread, his father had moved only to watch him make a spectacle? The thought was its own kind of humiliation. Robert Harrington's voice cut across the table. It was low and clear, the sort of voice that had been used to close deals. "Nathan," he said, each syllable a measured stone, "we are not here to create moral theater." Nathan turned toward his father. The father's mouth drew into a line that said he considered sentiment a disease. "This is not about theater," he heard himself say, and the phrase sounded both childish and urgent. "It's about human decency."
Robert looked as if he had swallowed lemon rind. His eyes were efficient, not petty. They regarded the boy in front of him with disappointment that had been practiced and honed by years of management. "Decency," he said, as if parsing a word, "is earned, not granted." "You're saying," Nathan began. Robert's hand rose like a gavel. "Sentiment," he said, and his voice was cold as polished steel, "is a cancer. It weakens institutions and makes us private men into public liabilities. We run a company based on clarity. Emotions muddle things." The sentence landed in the hush of the restaurant like an edict. For Robert, restraint had always been the scaffolding that kept his world from spinning. He could not imagine the world as anything other than a ledger. For Nathan, the ledger was a cage with different bars. Nathan's hand closed around the edge of the table until the knuckles whitened. It seemed to him, in that fierce and private flash, that the moment he had walked across the room, he had stepped out of line. He had placed himself where his father could penalize him with a look, where shareholders could deduce impropriety, and where the room could assign him motives he did not hold entirely. Clare watched the exchange with a new instrument, curiosity that had an edge of pity and another of anger. "Mr. Harrington," she said, addressing the elder man and bypassing the son as the person who had just assigned her value, "no one is asking for charity. We all just want not to be laughed at." "Avoid theatrics with my business's name on the table," Robert said, a reprimand wrapped in the language of reputation. "You're mistaken," she replied. "People like us don't get performances. We just get the joke." "And yet," Nathan said, softer now, "you're here." "Because someone made a bet," she said. "Because people like a story. Because I'm an experiment." She rose abruptly. The movement was small but decisive. It cut through the careful choreography of the room. Her bag swung against her hip, and the $4 whispered against the leather. She gathered her napkin in her hand as if it were a map. "You can keep your fries," she said to Nathan. "I came alone. I'll leave alone." She did not walk. She moved like a thing with a purpose. Out the door, into air that sat colder against her skin because the temperature of attention had not left her. People watched her leave, as if watching the end of a movie, as if they were owed that final beat. Outside, the city did not sound like the restaurant. It sounded like life. Cars moved. A bus arced to a stop. A boy kicked a can. The sharpness of being outside was a kind of clean shock to Clare's senses. It scraped away the interior lights and left her with the rawness of night, even though it was only late afternoon. Nathan stood in the doorway. He watched her shoulders vanish toward the corner where the pavement blurred into the thicker grain of the avenue. He had an impulse to apologize, to say anything to ease the sting she wore as if it were an accusation against him. He stepped into the door and then back, the pull of cowardice and the tug of something like responsibility holding him in the doorway. He followed her because the movement had been made in him and could not now be undone. He hit the street with a sense that he had the right to make amends, though he could not define what amends would look like. He had imagined, in some naive fiction, that a bowl of fries and the interruption of a joke could be his form of absolution. He had not imagined that the bowl would be read as a purseful of pity, or that his presence would feel to her like an intrusion into an already public wound. She turned at the corner as if to test whether anyone had followed. She did not run, but he could see the tremor around her shoulders. He closed the distance in 3 steps and put himself in front of her, like a gatekeeper. Cars whooshed by. A taxi honked. She smelled of lemon polish and something softer, sweat perhaps, or the cedar of the city's bones. "Look," he said, out of breath from crossing the small theater of pavement between them. "I didn't mean—" "Meaning doesn't matter," she said. Her voice had sharpened. "What matters is who does the fixing and who gets to be fixed. I don't—" She faltered as if the word had been a stinging thing. "To be fixed by you." "I don't want to fix you," he said. "I wanted them to stop." "Them stop because you moved, or because they could watch you move?" Her question had the precision of a blade. It stung him in a place where his motives had been fragile. "I'm not always like this," he said, a sentence that was both defense and confession. He hadn't meant to apologize for his better self. He did not yet know where his better self started and public performance ended. "Are you?" she asked. The laugh in it had no mirth. It was a question that could have been flung at anyone who ever tried to be somebody else for a moment. Nathan expected the exchange to end in one of two ways: an apology and a goodbye, or a longer conversation that might settle into something neither of them could yet name. She looked at him with eyes that did not soften. For a moment, the city held its breath, observing two young people at an awkward crossroad. Behind them, the restaurant door opened, and, like a weather change, Robert Harrington stepped out with 3 or 4 men in his wake, assistants whose faces were fluent in management. He watched the pair on the sidewalk with a gaze like a surveyor assessing damage. When his eyes met Nathan's, no warmth flushed Nathan's features. Instead, there was the flush of being caught. Robert's mouth tightened into something that was more disappointment than anger, a precise reprimand that traveled without words. "This is what I mean," Robert said to nobody in particular, but to all of them at once, his voice smooth with disdain. "Public performance, Nathan? Is that how you seek status now, by staging virtue?" Nathan felt a heat in his neck. He laughed at her, he said, and the words were a poor defense for a larger argument he hadn't yet formed. They used a phone. "Phones are tools," Robert said. "Tools are neutral. It is the hand that decides their use." "You can't reduce everything to profit margins," Nathan said. His words were clumsy in the face of the man who had taught him to translate feeling into figures. Sometimes sentiment is costly," Robert interrupted, "and costly things are unfit for enterprise." It was impossible not to hear in his cadence the way he made the world a ledger and forgot the people who fell between columns. Nathan looked at his father and felt the old map of their relationship, reward, disapproval, a geography of performance unfolding. He had not planned to defy him. Standing there in the street with a girl whose purse held $4 and a phone full of ridicule, he realized his defiance had a cost he had not calculated: the quiet, private withdrawal of the Harrington approval. Clare watched them as if watching a spectacle inside the spectacle. "You too," she said at last, voice small but clear. "Is this a family argument or a live demonstration of how power sits with its discomfort?" "Mind your tone," Robert said automatically, the reprimand a reflexive strike. "Don't tell me to mind my tone," she shot back. "You told me earlier that sentiment is a cancer, that it weakens institutions. Tell me, who writes the law that makes people like me disappearing acts? Who decides what is worthy of dignity?" Robert's face did not change in the way Nathan's would have if he had said the same words. He folded his hands like a courtroom judge and let the silence stretch. Around them, the city did what cities do. It swelled and receded like a tide. People walked by, a few stealing looks as if they might later be asked to testify. A dog barked. A woman with grocery bags hurried past and did not slow. Nathan could feel the shard of it, the way he'd stepped forward and been called back. He had not wanted to be a spectacle either. He had wanted to be an agent of decency,
and instead had created a scene that his father could use to teach him about costs. There was a coldness in his chest that had nothing to do with the weather. He had intervened, and yet it felt as if intervention had always been a language only the powerful used to make themselves feel generous. Clare, who had been steady through the humiliation, suddenly looked younger and more fragile, as if the strain of maintaining dignity were a weight her shoulders had not been meant to carry. She lifted the small folded bills out of her purse and held them up between two fingers. The money was an unremarkable thing, paper printed with faces and mottled ink. It looked somehow defiant in the air between them. "This is all I have," she said. $4. You can keep your lesson plans and your philosophies. I paid for my own seat. I didn't ask to be seen. When the stairs start, the world asks you to prove you are the same as them by buying what they buy. I've learned to refuse that kind of proof. Nathan stared at the bills, at the way the edges were softened by use. For a second, what had been a tableau, the heiress/poor girl dichotomy, dissolved into a human detail he could not manage with policy or with a checkbook. He wanted to reach out and take the bills, to make them disappear into his wallet, to erase the moment in the kind of literal, expensive way his father preferred. But that would have been another form of erasure. "Keep them," he said finally, and it was the worst thing he could say, and perhaps also the only honest thing. "Keep them and put them where you like. Don't let it be the measure of you." She let the money fall back into her purse. The sound of cloth folding, of leather resisting, was benign. She looked at him then, and for a beat their eyes met, not as two positions on a social chessboard, but as two people who had collided and not chosen the collision. "You don't get to decide morality for me, Harrington," she said, "and you don't get to be my hero." His name on her tongue had a weight. It felt like being named at a cattle pen, public and official. He flinched at the label, at the easy identity it grafted onto him. For an instant, the world narrowed to the space between them on that sidewalk. A girl with $4, a son who watched and then moved. "I don't want to be your hero," he said. The words fell awkwardly in the air. "Then don't pretend you were saving me." She turned away with a stiffness that declared the conversation closed. His name on her tongue had a weight. It felt like being named at a cattle pen, public and official. He flinched at the label, at the easy identity it grafted onto him. For an instant, the world narrowed to the space between them on that sidewalk. A girl with $4, a son who watched and then moved. "I don't want to be your hero," he said. The words fell awkwardly in the air. "Then don't pretend you were saving me." She turned away with a stiffness that declared the conversation closed. Her steps echoed on the pavement, a metronome keeping time with the way her throat tightened. Nathan watched her go, and the city closed in around him with the small, sharp sound of consequences. If he had been trying to do something good, he had failed to ask whether good could be purchased at the point of a public performance. If he had been trying to be seen as moral, he had succeeded at being seen as performative. Robert Harrington placed one hand on his son's shoulder, an action that was not tender and not cruel, but precise, as if adjusting the boy's posture for a portrait. "Appearances matter," he said, the sentence carrying instruction and warning in equal measure. "Control the stage, Nathan. We cannot allow sentiment to teach us how to run our affairs." Nathan felt the look his father gave him, and understood, with a clarity that was almost physical, that every move he made would be observed and scored. It was an old script. Do not be moved unless movement serves a larger plan. He had thought he had abandoned the script, but the script remained in the air,
binding him as neatly as any ledger line. Claire's figure receded down the block. For a long second, Nathan watched the place where she'd been standing, as if it might hold some clue. The restaurant door closed behind his father, and the world inside resumed its quiet choreography, the way people who have not been pierced by the moment make room for those who have. He stayed on the sidewalk longer than he meant to, feeling suddenly that his watch did not measure minutes, but the weight of a choice he had just made and could not now unmake. The image of the $4 folded in her purse would not leave him. It had the stubbornness of a small thing that refused to be invisible. Behind him, Robert Harrington's assistants murmured into the phone with the briskness of people brushing off a minor incident. A city bus swallowed the block and spat it out again. Nathan folded his hands in his pockets as if he could fold the moment into something manageable. He knew, in some indistinct but certain way, that what had happened at the table was not a single event, but the opening of a conversation that would not stop at the street. He had watched the girl with the $4 and, in doing so, had allowed the room to witness a fracture, a private dignity exposed by public laughter, and, for an instant, a man in a jacket who could have looked away, but chose to look instead. Whether his looking had helped or harmed was a question he could not answer yet. What he understood, with a clarity that prickled like cold on his skin, was that watching had consequences, and acting on the watching had consequences that cut deeper than any ledger. Claire walked until the city erased the sound of the restaurant behind her. When she finally slowed, she found a bench in front of a small park where a fountain sputtered, tired, into a pool. She sat and took the crumpled bills from her purse and smoothed them between her fingers as if smoothing might make them whole. Arthur's whistle rose in her memory, slow and plain as an instruction manual for living. Keep steady, keep present, keep worth. She did not cry. She had learned, in a childhood threaded with work and vigilance, that tears often made the world kinder in the wrong ways. She let the heat of humiliation blossom into another shape, anger, precise and cold. It was like setting a compass, from humiliation to indignation to a line of small, careful resolutions. She would not let the room define her. She would not live by the ledger of other people's attention. Somewhere in the city, Nathan walked the other way, head bowed in thought. His shoulders felt narrower than they had hours earlier. For the first time in a long while, he was not sure what his father's voice meant to him. Had he been obeying it all his life because it was necessary, or because it had become his habit? He had crossed a room to disrupt a mockery. He had not thought through what disrupting would mean. He had not thought, in his haste, how his action would recalibrate the way people measured Claire or him. On the bench, Claire took a small paper napkin out and folded it until the edges were crisp. She tucked the napkin into the purse with the $4 and for the first time allowed herself a thought that felt like possibility. Maybe, after the room had laughed and the sun had acted, something larger could happen. Not a rescue, not a transformation overnight, but a beginning. She did not know Nathan Harrington beyond the way he had tried to do a good thing badly. She did not want a story where a billionaire's son fixed the world with a credit card. She wanted small, stubborn choices that would add up to a life beyond other people's laughter. The streetlight near the park blinked on, as if to mark the end of one day and the start of the account that would follow. Claire rose from the bench and started home, the city humming around her. She kept the $4 where they belonged, safe and folded, and let the moment sit inside her like a new scar, visible only when she chose to show it. Behind her, in a world of polished glass and careful distances, Nathan stood where the shadows pooled and thought of how watching could become something more than an impulse. He watched the place where she'd gone, and, in the quiet the city gives between breaths, felt the first small inconvenient stirrings of what might someday be called loyalty, or something close to it. Clare walked the last 3 blocks home, with the city folding itself around her like a map being refolded wrong. Inside the Donovan apartment, the kitchen light smelled of lemon and warm fat. Mary had the radio on low as she rinsed a pan. Arthur, who had been dozing in his armchair with his cap loosed on his knee, straightened when she came in.
He rose slowly, the joints of his movements a ledger of years, and when he looked at her there was no pity, only a steady, plain appraisal that felt like a hand placed at the back of your neck to keep you upright. "You didn't answer when your phone lit up," Mary said, drying her hands and watching Clare with the fierce softness of someone who had worked herself into watchfulness. "You weren't meant for that, Clare." "I didn't want to give them the satisfaction," Clare said. Her voice had the brittle edge of someone who had been polite for too long. She took the 4 bills from her purse and smoothed them again on the kitchen table, as if the motion might iron out the moment they'd been through. Arthur folded his newspaper and let it rest on his lap. "You did what you could this afternoon," he said. "You kept your shoulders straight. That matters." "It felt like their decision," Clare replied. "They made a game of me, like I was an exhibit. I went to sit there and pretend I belonged, and they decided I didn't." Arthur's mouth closed for a breath. "People like to make games," he said. "That doesn't make them right. You don't have to play along with their rules to be worth anything." Mary came to stand close and put a hand on Clare's forearm. "Don't let them teach you how to value yourself," she said. "Say what you need to say. Hold the things that are yours: work, truth, your family." Clare's laugh was small and bitter. "Say what I need to say? To whom? To the room?" "To whomever listens," Arthur said, "but make sure it is your own voice doing the speaking." She thought of Nathan on the sidewalk, his suddenness, the way he had intruded and then been called out. She thought of his father's hand on Nathan's shoulder, precise and corrective as a tutor rearranging posture. She thought, too, of the way Nathan had sat with her, as if proximity alone could rewrite a humiliating scene. She had walked away because proximity had felt like pity. But on the bench later, with the $4 folded in the palm of her hand, a different thought had nudged at the edges of her plan. What if being seen could be turned into something else, something that didn't end with another person's charity? The next morning, the school was louder than usual. Gossip, like a living thing, braided itself through lockers and classrooms. At her first passing in the hallway, someone said something that made the sound of laughter collect like rain. Clare met most of it with silence. Humiliation had taught her the arithmetic of small, careful invisibilities. She had learned where to tuck herself to survive. But Mr. Harrison's gaze found her in the corridor. He had watched the restaurant incident from the outside, and the way his eyes registered her was not for entertainment. There was concern, yes, but also calculation, teacherly, public-minded calculation.
"Clare," he said later that morning in American history, after the class had settled into its benches and the hum of fluorescent lights, "Mr. Harrington and I spoke. It seems the events of Friday are unsettling, and there's an opportunity here." He glanced at Nathan, who sat at the back of the class with the kind of posture that suggested he was both present and withholding permission for anything surprising to happen to him. Nathan's jaw was a line. He had not been harmless in the aftermath. He had been the eye of a storm. The storm, however, had not blown over. "We will be doing a term project on civic influence and everyday labor," Mr. Harrison continued. Part of the grade will be a public presentation that blends research and testimony. It should be collaborative. I am pairing some of you based on what I hope will make your work stronger. Claire, Nathan, you will work together." There was an audible breath in the room. Whispers rippled and sank back into chairs. Claire felt the word paired, as if it were a little weight placed at the base of her spine. Mr. Harrison's eyes were kind, but there was steel in them. He had watched the way their moment had revealed something about the social architecture of the school. "I think you can do something meaningful," he told them both. "I think you can show people what they don't see." A small CTA, almost reflexive and unrelated to the moment but wired into how people now shared experience, might have appeared on a screen somewhere. "Where are you tuning in from?" But the work that followed would not be an online performance. This was the kind of work that asked for time, and for closeness, and for the slow unpeeling of assumptions. Nathan's first instinct had been a curt refusal. "I didn't come to be graded on other people's conduct," he said, and the sentence was a shield. He was not used to being assigned moral responsibility by a classroom. His life had been arranged differently. Mr. Harrison's face did not shift. "This isn't punishment," he said. "This is an assignment with a purpose. Take it." Claire met Nathan's eyes across the murmuring room. He looked like a man who had been handed a script and was deciding whether he could improvise. "If you want my time," she said, "you'll treat it like work, not an apology." "I don't expect apologies," Nathan replied. "I expect honesty. We'll do interviews. We'll do data. We'll bring people who know about actual labor into the room." "Not to perform them for the class," Claire said. "Not to make them props. To let them speak." He nodded grudging assent. There was something brittle in the agreement, a mutual mistrust that would, in time, wear into something else. They began where most careful projects begin, with a bibliography and a list of what counted as evidence. Claire brought, to their first meeting in the library, a small stack of notes, interviews she'd conducted with her mother and with Arthur, lists of tasks people did that rarely registered as work in official records. Nathan arrived with a leather notebook he kept from school that smelled faintly of his father's study, leather and lemon oil. He had pulled a few articles from online journals about the economics of unpaid labor, and some corporate case studies about restorative justice in the workplace. The library hummed around them, fluorescent, dusty, the soft tension of pages turning. They sat at a long table, a geography of books and laptops between them. At first, their conversations were tentative, like two dancers testing steps. Claire would speak about washing, ironing, hovering, about the invisible calendar that kept life possible. Nathan would talk about systems, incentives, and metrics. She kept her voice plain, he kept his words conditional. The difference between them was less about feeling than about assumption. She assumed her value had to be demonstrated by others. He assumed value was a thing you could safekeep in a bank of privilege. They found a hinge in the idea that would become the project's spine. One evening, over a stack of municipal reports and a printed transcription of an interview with the cafeteria manager, Nathan said, "There's a phrase in one of these that bothers me. They call it invisible labor, but that suggests it's unseen because it's not there. It's not invisible, it's ignored." Claire looked up. "Ignored," she repeated. "People choose to ignore it." "What if," Nathan said slowly, "we framed it not as invisible, but as an engine, the engine that keeps the visible stuff running?" She smiled despite herself, the thought connecting to something Arthur had said. There are tools for keeping upright. "Invisible engine," she repeated. "And maybe, on the other hand, there's the cage. Not just the engine, but the way some people live in gilded arrangements where choices are made for them." Nathan's eyes softened, a fold opening in his demeanor. "Gilded cage," he agreed. "The rules that are set for you, even when you think you're free." They started to sketch a structure. First, the data about unpaid work and labor distribution. Second, testimony of people whose work went uncounted. Third, analysis of how structures, corporate policies, social rituals made some labor invisible while making others ceremonial. Finally, they would propose a set of modest reforms the school could adopt: recognition, practical support, small policy changes that would not pretend to overhaul society. Clare insisted on names. "If we're talking about people's lives," she said, "we can't hide them behind statistics. We need to let them be people." Nathan argued for methodology. "We need to be rigorous," he said. "If we're asking the school to change policies, we need data they can take seriously."
So they balanced. Clare gathered voices, Mary's, Arthur's, the janitor's, and Nathan collated numbers and created charts that were disturbingly neat in their clarity. There were moments of friction. Nathan's tendency to systematize felt to Clare like a way of making messy grief into an Excel sheet. Clare's insistence on personal testimony threatened Nathan with being accused of sentimentality. They argued, sometimes sharply, but always with some return to work. The friction became a kind of polish. Outside of the library, the social climate shifted in small ways. Jessica Moore and Kevin found that their prank had consequences. Messages that once seemed casual were forwarded to parents, and whispers became awkward silences. Jess's friend group wavered, not apocalypse, but discomfort. The school's administration, prodded quietly by Mr. Harrison and by conversations that Nathan led, awkwardly, often half-right, offered a letter to the student body about respect in public spaces. No one pretended this changed the architecture of class, but it changed the tenor of the hallways. Nathan himself was not exempt from cost. His father's disapproval was not a private grumble. Invitations that once arrived like seasonal birds thinned. Nathan found himself less often in the right rooms. Some of his father's colleagues raised eyebrows. In the Harrington dining room, conversations with Robert grew thinner and harder. Business dinners were replaced by pointed silences. For Nathan, the cost was real enough. The thinning of social capital, the palpable recalculation of expectations. He did not regret his stance, not really, but the price had a taste he had not anticipated. At home, he and Robert argued in clipped sentences. Robert, who had crafted a career from the discipline of cold metrics, spoke as if defending an entire way of life. "You cannot let personal feelings dictate public policy," he told Nathan, as if the son were a subordinate making a tactical error. "Companies collapse under the weight of sentiment when they should be calculating risk." Nathan listened, teeth clenched. "Not everything can be reduced to risk," he said. "Sometimes the human costs are what make a company sustainable in the long run." "That's idealism," Robert retorted, "and idealism is for people who can afford it." "Maybe it's also for people who want to be decent," Nathan said. The sentence came out sharper than he'd intended. Robert's face arranged itself into study. He did not answer with malice, he answered with a doctrine. "Decency doesn't pay dividends," he said. "It complicates matters with emotion." "Is that why you want to keep emotion at a distance?" Nathan asked. "So the ledger stays clean?" Robert's sigh was a thing he used often in place of tenderness or explanation. "This is not about wanting," he said. "It's about surviving. I built things so they would last. Emotions corrode them." The conversation left Nathan tired, as if he'd been working through a long and necessary exercise in circumference. The project at school gave him a place to exert something other than defense. He could channel his unsettledness into work and watch patiently for the shape of something to change. As the weeks narrowed toward the presentation, their preparation tightened into rehearsals. Nathan and Clare developed a rhythm in public speaking that felt honest and not theatrical.
Nathan learned to let a sentence sit without trying to fix it with an expensive anecdote. Clare learned to put pauses in her testimony to give the room space to hear. When they combined their parts, data followed by voice, the effect was not showy, but it was precise. The classroom that would host their presentation was small, the fluorescent lights a little too bright, the projector's hum a thin strain. Families were invited. A few parents who wanted to see the spectacle of it all took up the back rows and waited for either triumph or collapse. Robert Harrington, who had announced no plans to attend, sat in the far corner in a gray suit that read as deliberate. He had not spoken to Nathan all week. His presence at the assembly was a thing that tightened the air. Clare's hands were steady as she arranged her notes. She had chosen not to bring the $4 with her onto the stage. It would have been a gesture too easily read. Instead, she had asked Arthur to come and sit near the front so there would be a face she knew. Arthur, with his cap and his slow smile, looked at Clare the way you look at a person doing something brave by being true to self. Unflashy, sure. Mary sat 2 rows back, the lines at the corners of her eyes deeper than usual. Nathan began the presentation with data, the proportion of unpaid labor done by women and the distribution of household tasks across income levels, visual slides that made the invisible pattern visible. His voice was steady, but he let Clare's parts have the air they needed. He gave no thundering soliloquies, no dramatic rescues. His role was to frame, to hold, to be the person who could open a door and not rush in to rearrange the furniture. Then Clare stood. The room shifted. Her voice when she spoke cut through the air like a simple bell. She told, in a measured cadence, of the afternoon at the restaurant, of walking 20 blocks in shoes that pinched, of the $4 folded in her purse, of the photo that had turned judgment into sport. She did not dramatize, she narrated. She spoke of the small, quiet labor, laundry, the folding of shirts, the ironing of collars, that kept other lives untroubled. She said, plainly, that such labor was not charity, nor was it to be objectified for another's entertainment. You will hear numbers in this presentation, she said. You will see statistics. But behind each statistic is a person. My mother is one of those people.
She got up at 5 this morning to make sure the house smelled like it belonged to someone who could pay attention to their life. That isn't invisible. It is vital. The classroom was silent in a way that felt almost sacred. There were no rustles, only the tiny mechanical hum of the projector. Clare spoke about dignity, not as a plea, but as a demand for acknowledgement. She asked the room to imagine a school where small acts of work were recognized in meaningful ways. Scheduled help for students whose family responsibilities made deadlines difficult. A community fund for necessary supplies. A list of contributions students could log that would be considered in the school's assessment of fairness. When she finished, Nathan did not step forward to take the applause. He simply sat and let her receive it. The sound that rose in the room was careful at first, and then more certain. Some of it came from students who had been moved by the narrative. Some of it came from parents who had finally heard something they had not yet considered. Even the teachers, who had been watching with an educator's skeptical heart, found their hands together. From the back, Robert Harrington watched. His face did not soften into approval. If anything, it remained its habitual shape, measured, guarded. But as he stood to leave, he did something not many expected. He looked at Nathan. The look that passed between them was small, a flicker of recognition that did not equal acceptance. It was, however, enough to make Nathan fold in a breath and feel something like permission, not to be forgiven, but to be seen. Robert walked out of the room with his posture unchanged. He did not clap. He did not speak to Nathan in the hall. He left, and yet the image of him exiting lingered like a punctuation.
It did not resolve everything, but it showed that even hardened belief systems register when confronted calmly and publicly by a truth laid plain. There were after effects that were practical and not miraculous. Mr. Harrison proposed a pilot recognition program for students who contributed to household labor that impacted school performance. The cafeteria staff were given a small raise after students presented their data showing the disparity in the school's budget allocation. Jessica Moore and Kevin faced parental repercussions, grounding, and required community service. None of these moves pretended to solve structural inequality. They were instead small corrections that acknowledged an uglier pattern and asked people to do better. In the weeks that followed, Clare found that the cafeteria no longer had the same sneers aimed her way. The mood of the hallway shifted a degree toward respect, not because the world had been rewired, but because the people in it had been asked to look with more precision. Nathan's life did not suddenly become simpler. He lost a dinner invitation, a piece of social ease. He gained, in return, something more slippery, a name he could live into that involved seeing others rather than performing to be seen. They met sometimes to continue work, sometimes to research, sometimes to talk. Their proximity did not bloom into a tidy romance. When there was small, soft moments, the way Nathan began to carry a sweater for Claire when the library drafts were cold, the way Claire let him into a joke about a misquoted statistic, they were tentative and private, not declarations. Both had reasons to move slowly. Claire had every reason to preserve the boundaries that kept her safe. Nathan had reasons to prove his motives were not posturing. One evening, after they had submitted their project and graded it with the unsparing eyes only students have for their own work, Nathan asked Claire if she would join him for a meal. He had invited, at his father's house, a suggestion, a return to the same restaurant where their rupture had first played out. Claire's first instinct was to say no. The memory there was jagged. But Nathan was not asking to reenact anything. He wanted something quieter, a sharing, small and equal. They sat under the same brass letters that glinted like a memory. The restaurant looked the same but felt different, less like an arena and more like a room where decisions had been made and remembered. Nathan ordered 2 Cokes and a basket of fries. He had discussed it with the manager beforehand. They'd pick the table at the window so it would be ordinary, not a stage. When the food arrived, the check was modest. The total came to slightly more than $4. Nathan slid a bill across the table in a clumsy imitation of the old script. Clara laughed softly and placed her own $4 down atop his. "You keep your change," she said, smiling. The line was light, but it carried weight. A refusal of rescue, a refusal of being bought back into dignity. He laughed then, not at her, but with the awkward happiness of someone who has learned a small lesson, that dignity is not a thing you give or take. It's a way people treat one another. "I didn't want to play at being noble," he said. "I just wanted to sit with you properly." "Properly?" she echoed. "As equals," he said simply. They ate the fries with a kind of deliberate slowness. It was not strictly necessary to speak of the weeks and the arguments and the work. Silence did not feel empty. Between them, the air was filled with small routines, the crunch of fries, the fizz of the Coke, the occasional window glare that made the brass letters into a softened hymn. Later, when the bill arrived, Claire folded her $4 and slid it across the table. "Keep it," she said, and there was a gentle finality in the gesture. "Put it in your jeans. Remember it when you forget who you're trying to be." Nathan hesitated. He wanted to protest in some grand way, to counter the gesture with a pre-packaged nobility.
Instead, he accepted the money and placed it carefully in his wallet, not as a stamp of purchase, but as a talisman, a small reminder that what mattered lived in the quiet exchanges of respect and not in headline acts. They left the restaurant without making promises. They were not a story resolved. They were two people who had changed the way they understood themselves and each other by the carriage of their decisions. The public win had been earned by work and by courage. The private settlement was a careful, unflashy recognition that progress is often a matter of small steps. In the weeks and months that followed, the school project continued to ripple in modest ways. Students looked at each other differently. The principal instituted a forum for student concerns. Families who had once shrunk from conversation found themselves talking about the work that kept households running. It was not sweeping change. It was, however, a series of small corrections that began to make a skeleton of possibility. Nathan and Claire's relationship, if such a neat word could be used, was a study in slow edges. They met to study. They met to check lists. They occasionally argued about whether Nathan's efforts came from genuine conviction or from a desire to perform moral standing. He allowed himself to be challenged. She allowed herself to be surprised. The center of the story was not a lover's declaration, but a steadier notion. Two people learning to hold space for one another's autonomy. Robert Harrington did not become a softened patriarch overnight. He watched his son in a watchful way that, over time, loosened into a different kind of appraisal. He continued to speak of efficiency and risk. Yet his distance was now marked with small tolerances. An acceptance of public charity done with care. A reticence to speak in absolute certainties in front of Nathan. Once, in a private moment, he asked Nathan a question that carried a kind of admission in its asking. "Do you still think sentiment is a cancer?" he asked, the words a test. Nathan met his father's eyes and did not answer simply. "I think sentiment that masks power is dangerous," he said. "But sentiment that recognizes another person as human, without wanting to own them, can change the way we run things. It can make us more careful." Robert's mouth set into its usual line. "Careful is a kind of risk," he said. "Maybe it's the kind of risk worth taking," Nathan replied. The exchange did not resolve them, but it shifted the tone. It was, in a way, enough. Months later, after the semester had closed and summer had begun to lay over the city's surfaces like a warm glaze, Claire returned to the same bench in the park. Arthur sat beside her, whistling a small tune as he folded a newspaper. Mary called in from the kitchen, asking if Claire wanted anything for supper.
The $4 sat in the small coin pocket of Claire's purse more as a memory than currency. Folded, worn, a memento of how a simple thing can carry disproportionate meaning. Nathan texted her sometimes now with article links or with notes about a lecture he thought she might like. The messages bore a new tone, less performance, more curiosity. Claire replied when she wanted to reply. The rhythm between them was one of negotiation. Neither had illusions that a few acts could end a system. They had, though, a shared project, to make the small place they could influence be better, to maintain a kind of fidelity to the promise of mutual respect. One day, as they walked past the restaurant on an errand, Nathan paused and looked at Claire with something like relief. "Do you want to go in?" he asked. She could have said no. She could have said yes and sat in silence. Instead, she shrugged and said, "2 Cokes and fries. Keep it modest." They ordered, sat at the same sunlit window, and when the food arrived, Claire took out the $4 and placed it on the table. "Keep some, take some," she said, with a small smile that did not demand anything. Nathan took it and tucked it into his wallet more carefully than he had tucked anything in recent memory. "I will," he said, not as proof, but as a reminder. The room outside the window continued its errands and its indifference. The brass letters on the door reflected a softer afternoon light now. People passed, some glanced in. The moment between Claire and Nathan was a small, contained thing, an arrangement not of rescue, but of agreement. It was, in its own modest way, a change. The city does not always honor small beginnings. Sometimes they fade like transient paint. But sometimes, when enough small beginnings are arranged consecutively, recognitions, policy nudges, a classroom that chooses to listen, a pattern emerges. It is not conversion, not fame, not triumph. It is a slow accretion of decency. Clare folded the napkin in her hands and let the conversation drift to ordinary things. Arthur's stubborn recipes, Mary's latest shift, Nathan's clumsy attempts at gardening. There was laughter that had no edges. There were silences that were simply companionable. When they left, they did not sign away their past. They carried it as people carry a map marked with cautious steps. He had watched, this was the first fact, the one the title would fix, and by watching had altered the room enough to force a conversation. She had captivated, not by the performance of being rescued, but by the unadorned clarity of her dignity when set beside the ledger and the lust for spectacle. The change that followed was not a gift bestowed by the wealthy, but a response to someone refusing to be reduced to a punchline. The city does not always honor small beginnings. Sometimes they fade like transient paint. But sometimes, when enough small beginnings are arranged consecutively, recognitions, policy nudges, a classroom that chooses to listen, a pattern emerges. It is not conversion, not fame, not triumph. It is a slow accretion of decency. Clare folded the napkin in her hands and let the conversation drift to ordinary things. Arthur's stubborn recipes, Mary's latest shift, Nathan's clumsy attempts at gardening. There was laughter that had no edges. There were silences that were simply companionable. When they left, they did not sign away their past. They carried it as people carry a map marked with cautious steps. He had watched, this was the first fact, the one the title would fix, and by watching had altered the room enough to force a conversation. She had captivated, not by the performance of being rescued, but by the unadorned clarity of her dignity when set beside the ledger and the lust for spectacle. The change that followed was not a gift bestowed by the wealthy, but a response to someone refusing to be reduced to a punchline.
If you read this and felt something move in your chest about the way people watch one another, consider leaving a word below. Which small gesture in this story struck you most? The watching, the speaking, the quiet return of $4? Share where you're watching from and what you think matters when dignity is at stake. If this story reached you, if Clare's $4 lingered in your mind the way it did in Nathan's wallet, consider subscribing for more stories that ask ordinary people to hold one another with attention. Like the video, leave a comment with the moment that stuck with you, and share it with someone who cares about how small acts become the first step towards something truer.